Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our third and final session of this LT Education Day. It's really great to see so many of you here with us again. So my name is Harriet. I am part of the UK and Ireland sales team. Today, for our third session, we are going to be hearing from Tom Broughton. I'm sure many of you have spoken to Tom in the past, but for those that have not, Tom is our customer success manager for our education customers. He is going to be going through some updates for LT, as well as some updates on our analytics within LT, which should be really exciting. Just like with our previous two sessions, this session is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube, so it will be available on demand later today. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your page. Either one of our panelists will answer them or Tom will address it at the end of the session. And we will have 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session to address any questions that you guys may have. So Tom, if you are ready, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Harriet. Just going to turn my video on. There. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me 1 second. So as Harriet mentioned, I'm going to just give you a preview of some of the upcoming feature releases for LT, specifically around the student dashboard and the analytics. So this is going to be the next big release in LT, and it's effectively going to revamp the student dashboard that you'll typically see here when you view a course where you've got students working. But it'll also replace the analytics button that you typically have access to when you go into student work and access a lesson. The analytics that you see under this button will actually be merged with the main dashboard. As I understand it, it's important to note that everything I'm about to show you is still in preview mode. It's subject to change, but we've already got some implemented features in our kind of test environment that I'm able to show you. And I'm also going to touch on a few upcoming additional features that will be added into that potentially for the upcoming release, although not all of them may make it in there. So just to caveat that, things that I show towards the end may not actually come in with the initial release, but we'll hopefully implement it at a later date if that isn't the case. So I am just going to switch to my preview cloud. So I've got an LT course here, my analytics course, which is in our preview workspace. So I've got access to some of the new analytics features that we're hoping to implement. So rather than seeing an initial dashboard as you do with the current iteration of the course dashboard, there'll actually be an analytics button here, which you'll need to click through to access the analytics feature for this course. You'll also notice there's a really quick overview here of how many students have accepted the invite, so you can quickly see which students haven't actually set up their LT account yet at a glance, as opposed to having to go into student accounts and find those that are pending and haven't set up their account. You can quickly see here exactly how many have actually accessed it at a glance. But let's hop into the analytics and take a look at what's already been implemented. And I do have some mock-ups of those upcoming features that may not make it in, which I'll show you as well. So if I click on my analytics button, I now get to visualize this course analytics page. So this gives me it's kind of, as I mentioned, kind of combines the student dashboard with the analytics button. So it's all in one place. You don't have to go to the analytics button to look at answer distribution and things like that. You'll just come to this one place. And you'll see that I have two tabs available. One will give me a view of my course from a lesson perspective, so showing me roughly what progress is like for any individual lesson or module within my LT course. And there's one here, which we'll look at in a second, which lets me look at particular students and get an overview of how they're progressing themselves within this LT course. So you'll see that all of my published content is visible here. So I've got a long volumes module comprising 4 lessons, and I've got a couple of standalone lessons down here. I can actually click through to a lesson to view the analytics and progress in a bit more detail. So you'll see how I get an at a glance kind of progress bar showing me that of my 4 students, one's committed, one's started it but not committed, and 2 haven't started it. But I can click through to view some additional analytics information for this particular lesson. So I'm now viewing this individual lessons analytics. So as I said, this is going to be added to hopefully before the release, but there's already some nice new features implemented in here. So you can see how many students have access, how many of those are committed. And you can also see how many, or the average number of questions attempted for all students is for this particular lesson. So there are 48 possible questions they can answer. And the average is they've attempted 2 questions effectively. Probably a better place I can show you is there's some grading in here actually that I can show you. It shows you a few more features. So you can see that the average number of questions that have been attempted by all students is 2. So the way this works out is there are 19 questions in this lesson, and one student has attempted 8 questions, and 3 students have attempted no questions. So the average of that is 2 question attempts. So you can roughly get an idea of engagement with the lesson by going into here. It'll tell you approximately how many questions the average student has answered so far. So on average, my students have only really worked through about 10% of the lesson. But of course, that's balanced out by only this one student who's actually answered 8. The others haven't engaged at all, but it does give you an average. And we'll see a little bit later on that you'll be able to see what an individual student is up to in that other tab. So just a few additional little features on here that have been added in. There's a students attempted column here, so you can scroll down and see where the distribution of question attempts actually is. We can see that it's actually the first 8 questions that have been attempted. And the latter questions in the lab haven't been gone through at all. So I've got that one student who's worked through possibly the first half or so of the lesson, and the others haven't engaged at all. But also worth noting is wherever you have questions that have marks assigned, so you've used the graded assessment type or you've used the graded and instant feedback assessment type, there will actually be an average mark for that question shown in this column here. So again, this is only counting those students that have attempted the question. So obviously this student here has attempted the question and got full marks. Obviously the other 3 students haven't attempted it, so their mark is not factored in here. They haven't been marked yet. So again, you can get an idea of how well your students have actually done for these individually marked questions. So you can get a clear idea of perhaps where they've been struggling. You can look at the individual questions and see, sure, the average grade is pretty low. It's 1 out of 3 here. Why? There's obviously an issue there. I need to go and look at that question and perhaps engage with my students as to why they found that question particularly tricky. You'll also notice that where there are MCQs, these are actually also clickable. I can actually click on those and it will show me the answer distribution. The one that has the tick next to it is the correct response. So you'll get a clear idea again of where the answer distribution is lying. Again, this is something that's merged from the analytics button that is currently available in student work. Rather than it being in there, it's now moved into the lesson analytics. So yeah, I can drill down to an individual lesson and see the progression, the number of question attempts, and if I have marks assigned, how well my students have on average done within that lesson. There is hopefully going to be some more added to this, which I will touch on towards the end of this a little bit. So if we go back by clicking on this button here, I can go back to my main dashboard here. And I can actually click on students to give me an overview of how individual students are doing within my LT course. So here are my 4 students. Again, I get an overview dashboard showing me roughly where they're at. We can see that I've got one student who's highly engaged. They've committed all of the lessons. We've got another who's committed some and is working on others. And we've got a couple who are not really engaging. They've not even started anything. But again, I can actually drill down to these individual students and take a look at where that progression actually is. Again, this is hopefully going to be added to prior to the main release, and I'll highlight that a little bit later on. But I can very quickly just dive in here and see where my students are at in the individual lessons. Perhaps a better one is to go into the second student. So I can see where they're working, where they've committed, where they haven't worked, and I can communicate with them appropriately if I need to get them to engage with the course content. So as I said, there's actually not too much more to show within analytics. It's still being built, as I said. It's currently in preview mode, and the development team are hoping to add a bit more to this as they progress. And I've got a few screenshots of some mock-ups of some of the upcoming hopeful releases. Again, I can't really promise that these additional things will be added, but we're hoping we can get them in before the release. So I'll just bring these up one at a time. So the idea is you can get an average grade for your overall lesson. So rather than just showing just the average grade for individual questions, you'll also get an overall average grade within the lesson's individual analytics. So again, you can get a clear overview of, on average, how well have my students done within the entire lesson as opposed to individual questions. A bit more of a useful statistic. We're also hoping to show lesson progression. So you'll be able to filter by which students haven't started, which students have, which students have committed, which are still working on it, which students haven't started, and be able to identify them within the analytics. Currently, you can't do that. We're also hoping to show a commit time. So when you go to the student's individual dashboard, you'll be able to see next to the individual lessons what the commit time was. So when they actually finished it, as well as their grade in addition to that. And we're also hoping that you can, as mentioned, you can view the mark that the student got for the individual lessons as well, where you've got gradable content. So there's hopefully a little bit more to be added to analytics, but the idea is we're going to try and combine the analytics button with the dashboard and add to it to give you a much clearer idea of where your students are, and be able to at a glance look at a given student and see all of their progression within all the published content. At the moment, you have to, if you go into student work and look at student progress, you have to do that on a lesson by lesson basis. So you're only seeing, the grade for that lesson for that student. You're only seeing their current status, their current rate of progression for that lesson. You can't get an overall overview of their overall marks and their overall engagement. You can just see that very much at a glance on the current dashboard. But the idea is that the upcoming analytics dashboard is going to give you a lot more detail to a much higher level of depth as opposed to just the current general overview. So that's going to be fully revamped. I don't have an exact release date. Our development team is still engaging in a series of sprints to push features out. But as I'm sure you're aware, as we add these things in, bugs crop up. Our development team are pretty transparent, and we have a little channel where they post all the updates they're releasing, and a few of them are to address bugs that are introduced when they implement a new feature. But it should be released hopefully by the end of this year. But I don't have an exact date. These are always subject to change. So keep an eye out for the dashboard actually changing. If you see that dashboard suddenly disappeared and you've got the analytics button, that's because we've now pushed out the updates to that analytics feature. And that's that's what we're working on right now, is looking to develop that and release that. Okay, I'll address some questions towards the end. I'm also going to touch a little bit on the grading features of LT. There's a few new features that have been added, but there are also a few key things that you can use LT grading for that you might not kind of think of. I'm aware that a few people on this call might have only just taken up LT, and maybe it's your first year using it. So I've used grading in perhaps a slightly different way within this LT course here. So rather than using grading to formatively assess your students or summatively assess them, which is what you might initially think the grading is primarily used for, It's actually incredibly useful as a feedback mechanism, because a new change to the LT grading means that you can always view student responses to questions, regardless of whether they've got marks assigned. For those of you who've used LT for many years, you're probably aware that initially you couldn't view student responses in the grading interface unless they had marks assigned. So that meant if you wanted to view student answers in a concise way and you forgot to assign marks, there wasn't really a way of quickly viewing them all in succession. You could kind of go in and look at the entire lesson, but you have to scroll through all the content. The fact now is that you don't have to do that anymore. So what I've done is actually designed an additional lesson that I've tacked on to one of our existing modules that I'm using to actually get these students to evaluate LT. So I'm just using the grading functionality to actually collect feedback. And because you can also use LT to provide individualized comments on student answers to questions, I can actually use LT to feedback directly to them within LT. So when they log in, as we'll see, I've already done some feedback, but I'll log in as a student and my academic has looked at my feedback and actually responded within LT. So I'll be able to see their response to my feedback. So this can be particularly useful for those of you that want to evaluate it in your first year and you want to gather that kind of that feedback from your students and get that kind of evidence to show that LT is beneficial. You can actually add that as an individual lesson, tack it onto the end of one of your modules. I'll just show you what it looks like. I've just simply added a new lesson to the end of my module. I know the image looks a bit out of place, so I just did it quickly yesterday. But if you hop in here, I've just used LT to deliver a series of MCQs, asking them a few key questions about how they found the platform, and also given them the option to provide a more detailed written feedback on the last page of the lesson. So they've just got to go through and collect or answer all these questions. And again, this will play in nicely with the new analytics feature, because I'll be able to go in and look at the answer distribution and go, okay, of all the students that responded to the question, I access the LT e-learning module easily, what was the distribution? Was there a large number of those in the positive top two? Were there a larger number in the bottom two? I can then follow up my students and ask a more detailed question, to them, and ask them why they found it difficult to access it, or why they found it easy to access. So I've just used MCQs here. Again, I haven't assigned marks because I don't need to anymore. Just get the student to work through this, and I then have a general comments text box. And again, because I can go into the grading and actually view the feedback and respond, which is a really nice use of the LT grading feature that not a lot of people often utilize. They get very tunneled on using the questions and grading to assess the students when actually you can gather feedback. And of course, I have a report so they can commit. I can then view their question in their answers in the grading interface and respond. So if we just hop out and go back to the admin view and just go into the grading, we can see what kind of information we can actually view in there. So I'm just going to go in and access my feedback lesson. So yeah, I think that this button will likely disappear. I think there's actually nothing in here. If I click on this, the old analytics, it doesn't load anything because they've kind of been merged. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention that will be hopefully implemented for the analytics is we hope to have the distribution shown for the other different question types as well, not just MCQs. I forgot to mention that. But I can kind of hop into grading and I can grade, quote unquote, their responses. And the grading grid obviously gives me a nice, concise view of the students' responses. So I don't have to scroll through all the content. It will just show me all the responses to the questions. And if I want to, I can enter some feedback, maybe not so relevant for these MCQs, but certainly once we get to the wider free text question, I can view the student's response and I can actually provide some feedback. So I'm providing a comment on their answer, but in this case, I'm actually using it to respond to what they've mentioned in their written feedback here. So you do have the ability to, hop in and, use this for feedback as well as using it for formative and summative assessment. So I can respond. I don't have to assign marks or anything. And when I'm ready, I can release the grades. Again, quote unquote, the grades. I haven't assigned any marks. I can show them their grades. And then when they log in, they're going to be able to view my responses. So if I switch to my student account here and access my feedback lesson, I'll get an overall, I get my overall mark, quote unquote. I don't get anything, but because it's not assessed. But if I go to the general comments page, I actually can then see my answer and I can see the feedback from the grader. So this student said that not all the content lined up with what was covered in the recorded lectures. So what can we do to strip that out? And the graders said that, yeah, this has been a common request from a lot of students. So we're hoping to, the next set of content, we're hoping to trim that down to remove or adjust any of the content so that it lines up with what's being covered in the lectures and seminars. So I've just kind of used LT. It really didn't take me very long to do this, to design a quick quiz. The questions I've used are just kind of questions that we've pre-created. We often use these questions for those of you that are trialing LT and want to get an evaluation on how the student felt about it. These are kind of the common questions that we suggest, but of course you can design the questions as desired. Just worth noting, if we hop back to the grading grid, there's a few features in there that can assist with this type of kind of using LT for feedback that I kind of didn't mention. If we go back into the grading, again, there's a little kind of gear menu at the top here for grading options. So this is where I can show questions that haven't been set up for grading. So I simply check this box, and any questions that don't have grading or instant feedback and grading assessment mode set, I can still choose to show those, which is what I've done here. You'll notice that for these questions, none of them have a maximum mark at the top. So they're kind of ungraded, but I can still view them in the grading grid and respond to them. Also worth noting that you can actually anonymize the list of names here. So there's a little checkbox here that says hide student names. So I don't actually see who the individual students are. I'm sure one question I often get asked is, well, I don't have to go in here to turn that on, and therefore I can see the list before I anonymize them. Yeah, it can't be locked. I mean, you can toggle it on or off, but if you're worried about accidentally glancing at their names, just add yourself as a student temporarily and complete a lesson, and then go into here so you can access the grading grid, and then turn on the anonymization, the hide student names checkbox, and then remove yourself as a student, and you've then configured that for any actual real students, so that you don't accidentally see their names. You can also export the responses as well. So if you wanted to collate them, you can do so. If we just exit out and we go back one step to view the general lesson management menu here. If I go to the gear menu, I can export the student answers. So this will give me a grid, and it will list the text or the response that the student gave for each question. But it's worth noting that this isn't anonymized. When you export in this way, it will just have their email next to each set of question responses or text that they've written. So just bear that in mind. If you really do want it anonymized, you can't really export it in this way. You probably have to take notes elsewhere if you truly didn't want to accidentally view the student emails. But you can get them out. It'll just save it as a CSV file, and will collate their responses in a spreadsheet that you can then place elsewhere or upload elsewhere, depending on what you want to do with that, whether you want to present it to other members of staff or include it as part of a business case. You can actually do so. And if you are formatively assessing students and you want the marks, again, it's not really relevant here, because I'm using it for feedback. I'm not assessing them. I can export the marks that I gave for individual questions if I want to. Again, this will just be a grid, showing a list of the marks, the individual questions for each student. And again, it's not anonymized. So I just thought I'd mention, especially because a lot of people are using LT this year for the first time, that you can use LT to gather the feedback on the platform itself. It's quite elegant just to have an extra lesson at the end after the lab session, after they've done the virtual lab, just to get them to evaluate and feedback, because obviously student feedback is extremely valuable in determining, how well the platform's gone down and whether it is going to be valuable for you moving forward. The students are the ones benefiting the most from this. Obviously, it's highly beneficial for you guys in the academic world, but for the students, it's also they're the ultimate end users, quote unquote, of the platform. So you can use LT to collect their feedback rather than doing it separately if you want to go down that route and have everything in one place. And that's kind of all I wanted to cover, just a little bit on what we're working on and what's going to be coming up, and also just a few little grading tips and show off some of the newer little features we've got in the grading for those of you that haven't sort of looked at that side of things yet. So that's me. Open the floor up to questions, I think. Again, as mentioned, you can post a question in the Q&A button at the bottom, or you can type in chat. So Ian's asked, can you use any of the question formats in the L2 feedback type lesson? Yeah, you can. It's nothing specific. I've just created a new lesson and populated it with questions. So depending on what you want to ask them, you can use any of the 9 different question types. Yeah, there's no limitation there. It's not a special lesson. It's just a normal one that I've just populated with questions, using the question function to gather feedback rather than assessing them on the content.
Thank you so much, Tom. Just a reminder to everyone that if you would rather ask a question to Tom verbally, you can just use the raise your hand function and we can unmute you.
So Darren's asked, can we export the analytics data? Not at the moment, as far as I'm aware. As I said, I only have access to the current iteration of the analytics in the preview cloud, and there are potentially more features to be added. So we'll see what comes out on release. But if that's a key feature, then we'll make a note of that and put it on our ideas board to work into hopefully a future release if we hear enough people needing it. Oh, if students are filling in a question table, how will that appear in the exported CSV file? I think it'll just pass the text with some kind of separation. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly what. It'll still, I believe it'll still be within one cell, but there'll be a separator between the individual, what would be the individual cells in the question table. So it should populate that. The cell will be probably quite filled with a lot of information. Obviously, when you export the CSV file, the cell size is kind of normalized. It's your standard width, but it's obviously populated with a large amount of text depending on what the students, the length of their response should be. So yeah, it will just be passed with a separator between the cells. From top left to bottom right, I think. Top left going across.